Okay, welcome everyone to our 9th session of Radical Mindfulness. I'm really glad to be with you all, and especially on this snowy evening here in Ottawa. It's I have my blanket, I have my book, I have my tea. All of you, I'm very content right now. Yeah. So we're starting chapter 5, Human Supremacy, page 97, for those of you listening now and future listeners. And as always, I'll start reading, but please jump in, ask questions, and we'll trade back and forth. So, Human Supremacy, Ernest Becker and Terror Management Theory, co-authored with Darcy Matthews. Our mother grows angry. Retribution will be swift. We squander her soil and suck out her sweet black blood to burn it. We turn money into God and salivate over opportunities to crumple and crinkle our souls for that paper, that gold. Money has spent us, left us in small boxes, dark rooms, bright screens, empty tombs, left investing our time in hollow philosophies to placate the fear of our bodies, returning back into our mother. And Tanya Tagaq, if you've had the privilege of seeing her, she's both a writer and a musician. She is a shapeshifter. If you ever have a chance to see her in concert, like she's an incredible performer. But there's also like, oh, there's something else happening here. And she has a very creative kind of brain-bending work of fiction too that if that appeals, I really enjoyed it, but it's kind of trippy. It's very different from a conventional novel. From governments declaring climate emergencies to debates about whether the sixth mass extinction is already upon us, we live in a period of heightened ecological crisis. Scholars have long pointed to narratives of human supremacy as central drivers of ecological destruction. One of the more prominent thinkers to make this argument was Lynn White Jr. in his famous essay, The Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis, a text that has been credited with shaping the fields of environmental history, environmental philosophy, and the environmental humanities more generally, as well as American environmentalism as a social and intellectual movement. White's basic argument is that doctrines of human supremacy, forwarded by currents within Christianity, have enabled particularly extractive and destructive relations with the other than human world. Euro-Americans, for White, have positioned themselves as superior to nature, contemptuous of it, willing to use it for our slightest whim. White was himself a Christian and encouraged his fellow Christians to revisit their tradition and find new ways of telling Christian stories that promote stewardship. In every complex religious tradition, he wrote, there are recessive genes which in new circumstances may become dominant genes. I do want to pause there already because, I think the way Christianity is woven into this is so consequential. And the Christianity and also, the way it changes over times, the Protestant Reformation, which goes hand in hand with the invention of the printing press, with the scientific era, and this idea that, like when you think about literacy and that, we're breaking things down into individual letters, that becomes a technology that influences our culture, and it leads to this idea of looking at things in terms of the individual as opposed to the collective, the whole and the all. And so it really made, I think that fire, the printing press, and now AI are probably going to be, this is my opinion, the three biggest technologies that like just completely reshaped culture. And I don't know what AI is going to do to us, um, but this idea of Christianity being part of what contributes to human supremacy, because the individual is the thing that matters. I'm saying that like this is a belief system that we have, and um, that the earth is there for us to use, and if I matter as an individual and not as part of a collective, if I am, by being Christian, trying to overcome death, which I think is part of the narrative, uh, I really see how all of this is amplified or exacerbated by Christianity. And so something that we really, I think, need to track. And it can be really contradictory because, there's, so much good comes out of the Christian tradition, but I think there is a lot of harm as well, or at least harmful thinking, that it has made everything about the individual experience, and that then allows us to harm the world around us. And whether it's like Jesus is my personal Lord and Savior, or the fact that these resources are here for me to become wealthy, those are sort of spoken and unspoken. And the other thing that I wanted to mention, another reason to pause, is because we're talking about or he's mentioning the environment and climate emergency. I just want to recommend an extraordinary book. I'm posting, oh, that's an article. Is that going to work? Pollution, Pollution is Colonialism by Max Laboran is, it's a book that just kind of blew my mind, honestly. And because it's giving you, Max is an indigenous scholar. And so for me, what was so great about it was I then got to see the world through another cultural lens. And so I found it to be really eye-opening and really edifying. So if that's a topic that's of interest to you, I really recommend it. And I think you can get the free PDF. Future readers, I posted a link in the chat, but if you just Google "pollution is colonialism," you'll find their work.
Kelly, I'd love to add one thing because my focus is fashion and I teach, but I've also gotten into emerging technology. So AI is obviously way up there, but I'm also trying to preserve, the handedness of things and making and artisanal craft. I mean, I'm sitting here making things. And I do want to mention a woman who is very deep in the space, and she is trying to figure out how to live like for 200 or 300 years, and she's like implanted, she's gotten a chip implanted. I mean, there's like crazy time. I'm like, who wants to live for 200 or 300 years? Everybody's going to die around you. So this, these issues are real. I mean, it's like when I read that, I was like, what are you doing? That's crazy. But it's
Yeah,
not just AI. It's like, let's try to live forever.
it's not just AI, but like, how is AI going to reshape how we see the world? But yeah, this is the thing. Silicon Valley, this is their next big project.
Elon Musk.
Elon Musk, how do we upload our consciousness so that we can live forever? And I'm like, if you don't have your body, is that the same? I mean, it's fascinating. And never mind cryogenics, and I'm just going to freeze myself and then be reanimated down the road. Like it's extraordinary the lengths that people will go to avoid death. Karen, what were you going to say?
There are already products being marketed for people who I guess they must upload some of their words and wishes and images, and their what's the word I want? The holodeck concept from Star Trek or Star Wars or whatever that show was. But I mean, there are people out there now that are actually selling product that will do that, so that you can talk with your loved one after they're dead, or at least that's what
Oh,
they're.
Jesus.
Yeah, it's happening. It's happening now.
Yeah. And it's so, I mean, again, I'm fascinated because to me, this is like the extension of like what's being mentioned here. The when we, that again, the printing press literacy, it gets us focusing, or the measure is the individual, that we're breaking things down into those smallest parts. That's a belief of science that, if we break it down small enough, we can understand anything. And, this idea of like uploading your consciousness or having a holodeck, like you have to leave all of, you can't be including relationships as part of what it means to be alive, if that seems like a solution to you. I feel like I haven't expressed that very well. But if you see yourself as embedded in a web of connection and relationships, and the tree outside my window, and my people in the next room, and the trees that are like the house that I'm sheltered in, if I'm part of all those things, then am I still me if it's just my consciousness that's been uploaded to the cloud or something? Like you have to be able, or like it's a kind of thinking that cuts any ties from anything else if you are only your thoughts. Like we're not even connected to our bodies anymore.
Right.
We're now just our thoughts and our cognition. And uh, I'm very curious about, like, it's not sort of blaming or shaming, but just the like, oh, is this the logical outcome of what started 500 years ago? Kat saying that science breaks things down smaller, but they find a layer of complexity they were not expecting. This all adds to separatism. Yes, people need to go the other way and find our commonalities. Yeah, and it's, and this is where, again, it's no blaming and shaming, because scientific advances have brought us just incredible things, but we don't recognize that it is a belief system among other belief systems, versus it being like, this is what's true, and what is more right than anything else. And quantum theory is really teaching us that even within science, that like you have to include the whole and the all, that actually complexity kind of rules the day.
Well, and the lack of being able to let someone die and let that happen, ourselves or others. There's, I don't know football. I think it's Tom Brady, but some big football guy has like a clone of his dog because his dog died and he didn't want to get a different dog. He wanted the same dog, which of course it's not, but just that inability to, like, yeah, to mourn and be with the loss of that wonderful dog, I'm assuming. So
I have one other real life example of you saying your consciousness and downloading your consciousness. So this is a real thing. I don't know if anyone knows the designer Norma Kamali. She's an American designer that's been around for 50 years. So she's been around for a long time. She's been very successful, and she's probably almost 80 now, but she's very technologically forward, strangely. And so she tells the story that she went to Abu Dhabi, and there were businessmen there asking her if they could download her brain. She was just, because they wanted to use her brain as a designer, because there's almost no one who's been in business for 50 years to then create new product based on her brain. So she was like, no, except for then she came back to the States and found somebody who could help download her brain into an AI co-pilot. That's all I have to say. So it did do that, and it's using AI, and I don't know what to tell you, but that's a true story.
Wild. Yeah.
Yeah.
These are things I'm not so much up on. Oh, Karen says, excuse me, they're
I
called
just Googled
oh,
dead bots.
dead bots. Okay. This is like
bots.
the AI avatars that we can create.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Except
Yeah.
this was,
And
the normal Kamala
what
thing.
you're talking about is different, Kathleen. I know.
It's like a
Yeah.
really,
Yeah.
but it's more based on her, it's not like they like plug into her brain, it's like all this 50 years of, all of her designs and sketches and things, and then it goes into the large language model and spits out new things.
Mhm.
So fortunately, there's no plug into her brain, but not yet.
Yet.
Yeah. Yeah, I do. I realize that those dead bots are meant to be a comfort and again, mercy, because people are grieving, and that will probably feel really appealing. But again, I'm like, are we just going to be surrounded by zombies 10, 20 years from now? Like, how will this be different? And yeah.
Well, it's interesting. One of the sub sections of this article is titled "The Death of Death?" ?
Right. Right. Well, might be a little bit of human hubris.
Yeah, just a little.
White was writing at a time of ecological awakening. His essay was published 5 years after Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and 2 years before the Cuyahoga River fire that helped galvanize environmental sentiment in the United States. And yet, growing environmental consciousness did not bring him much hope. In a 1973 follow-up essay, he reflected on how very few people advocate for pollution, and yet the ecological crisis only accelerates. For White, the crisis deepens because all specific measures to remedy it are either undercut by legitimate interest groups or demand kinds of regional cooperation for which our political system does not provide. White continued with a stinging argument, especially when observed from the perspective of contemporary climate inaction. We deserve our increasing pollution because, according to our structure of values, so many other things have priority over achieving a viable ecology. White did not deny the material force of special interests and political organization, but argued that one reason these forces were so difficult to reverse was culturally conditioned and deeply ingrained human supremacy. I just want to kind of mentally underline that, and why I like to flag, the noticing of, oh, this is a belief, a cultural belief. Like when I try to notice it in myself, that I've been taught or conditioned to think this is true. And why I appreciate when, it's kind of like the pollution is colonialism, like when I can bump into or experience seeing the world through a different lens. And I think most of us here are part of the dominant culture. And so we don't necessarily have the chance to recognize our biases sometimes. Yeah, so I'm going to say that line again. White did not deny the material force of special interests and political organization, but argued that one reason these forces were so difficult to reverse was culturally conditioned and deeply ingrained human supremacy. The worsening ecological crisis suggests that human supremacist values remain intact. A 2002 survey, for example, found that nearly half of Americans, approximately 48%, agreed with the claim that, quote, humankind was created to rule over nature, end quote. While not a majority, 48% is still a large number with explicitly human supremacist values. I'm going to pause there to also say, I have a a thing that I try to notice is, are we, when we talk about what our right is, our right to this, our right to that, where is the recognition of our obligation? And like I think this is a good example of, that almost half of Americans believe that humankind was created to rule over nature. That's our right. So says half of the population. But what would we say about our obligation? And anyway, that slows me down as something to reflect on. Moreover, for White, quote, the understanding of a society's value structure must be based less on what that society says about itself than on what it actually does, end quote. Yeah, what's being done rather than what's being said. From White's perspective, respondents who reject explicit master over nature orientations likely still hold unconscious attachments to human supremacy, since a viable alternative has yet to become deeply rooted through the Euro-Americas, and ecological conditions continue to worsen. And a comment from Kat, it'd be interesting if there was an age demographic on that 48%. I agree. I'm curious. White's thesis anticipated recent work on the role of affect, or the role of affect, or often subconscious feelings and energetic pulses in shaping environmental outcomes. He thought that value change would be difficult since, for him, human supremacy was deeply rooted in the minds, bodies, and emotions of Euro-Americans. For White, quote, the artifacts of a society, including its political, social, and economic patterns, are shaped primarily by what the mass of individuals in that society believe at the subverbal level about who they are, about their relation to other people and to the natural environment, and about their destiny. I also just, end quote, and I also kind of want to, I think I've already said it, but highlight, what that society believes and that it's at a subverbal level. I think we don't do a very good job recently. And maybe historically this was different, but I don't think we do a lot to interrogate our beliefs as a society. I think I don't know why it is, but it seems to me that there's a lot of, this is just how it is. This is just human nature. And we don't actually recognize that, no, this is just a belief system, a belief that we have. And it's not necessarily true in other cultures. It's not necessarily true for other moments in time. And I don't know, is that a lack of diversity in our population? I'm not sure why that has become the case, but I think we confuse beliefs for facts or knowledge a lot of the time. Cat, questioning beliefs has to happen in individuals first. Then it can spill over into a questioning of cultural beliefs. Yeah, but do you mean the individual can question the beliefs of the culture, or that they have to have that self-reflection of who they are as individuals, their own first? Yeah, fair.
Think about my octopus teacher and how many people were, including myself, were so drastically changed by that one movie and getting a different feel for, animals that we have made assumptions about. Also animals we don't spend a lot of time with because, of the environment, but people have made, so many assumptions about how animals are or were. And I'll just say, for me personally, that was the last day. Like, I never ate octopus again after that, and I had eaten it before that. And I know the moment in the movie where my mind changed too. Like, I remember specifically Um, that, and then I was also thinking just about science, and, science is so important, but then we also sometimes just take it, like without all of the citations, we don't always, we, I don't know, society made a lot of assumptions based on science, and then we found out later, like, oh, we didn't actually like do any science on women, you know. And you can ask a woman, like, do certain medical procedures hurt, and we will tell you yes they do, but the doctors will look you square in the face and is like, this isn't going to hurt, that didn't hurt, and so I think there's, what I'm trying to get to is, I think there's some sort of not just questioning, but also listening. So, like, listening to the animals, listening to ourselves, listening to other people with different views, listening to like some of our guts around being around animals in the forest and what feels alive. And, and then we find out, like, oh, when we do science a little differently, it actually catches up. But if we're doing science, which is our, law of what's real, from this place of human supremacy, then we've already made so many assumptions. And then we just keep refilling our own cup with the same wrongness. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, what a beautiful example, Valerie, my octopus teacher, of how, we can be introduced to a new way of seeing, a new lens to look through. I think that's a great example. And I also appreciate, the what you just said too about, I mean, and my orientation is very much towards science rather than the arts. Like, I feel that's maybe even a bit of a personal failing, but like, it's my jam. But I recognize that it doesn't, it's not meant to explain everything. And to your point, Valerie, like, that has been often the case. And this is not recognizing that it is another belief system, but like, that's not happen, like, the experience you're having, the pain that you're experiencing in this procedure, it's not happening because we don't have any data to support it. And of course, we don't have any data because you didn't do any research on it, but that's part of, that's one of the beliefs within that system. And again, science, amazing, lots of great achievements, but this interrogation, this self-reflection, it's why it's so important. Were you going to say something, Karen?
Yeah, that just reminded me of well, it seems now that relational therapy is starting to really stir this up a little bit, where the emphasis is on, if the other person says they feel something, pay attention. It's real. You no more gaslighting. Ha ha ha. But the second thing that was just said about, I remember getting a procedure that was so painful. And, it may not be painful for a lot of women, but it was for me excruciating. And I said to the provider, I said, I mean, this was something that it was a diagnostic, and it was something that anybody could do without major harm, I guess. But I asked this woman, how many times have you done this to other people? It was a woman. I said, have you ever had this done to you? No. I said, what the heck? How can you be providing this? It just seems so, it's like, somebody told me to do it, therefore I will. And whatever you have to say doesn't matter. I was fairly outspoken after that. But it just, I don't know if they ever did it. Maybe I scared them off. I'm not going to do that. It's going to hurt.
Well, and I was just thinking about what it would be like, if we think about accepting that we're wrong about something, if we question our own beliefs and then we find out that we are wrong. If I dig deeply after that, I have to come to terms with, oh, all the times I did that thing with that wrong thing in my head, I was actually yeah, it was causing harm I wasn't aware of in a way I wasn't aware of. And I think of all those doctors that would then have to think, oh my God, I did all those things. And I said
Yeah,
that
but they
50
made it.
times.
They made it through bleeding and leeches and stuff, so maybe they can evolve a little bit.
Yeah.
Leeches.
Like we can. And I think Kat's comment that we project our understanding onto others, people, and animals, time to be totally open to the experience of others. And I'd add to that, I think we're, like that we project our understanding, we're projecting our beliefs as well. And, we probably have a little more capacity to recognize that there can be many things true at once. If values reside in unconscious and subverbal realms, then seeking to change them solely through rational and explicit argumentation will be fruitless. So the rational and explicit arguments, that's coming from a cognitive place. If this stuff exists in the subterranean, the unconscious in our bodies, then we can't actually get at it with the tool of being logical or presenting a solid argument. And to continue, a lesson the environmental movement still struggles to internalize. As White concluded in his original essay, we must rethink and refeel our nature and destiny. While he was ahead of his time in emphasizing emotion, feeling, and embodiment when theorizing cultural change, White neglected to ask why human supremacy remains such an attractive value in the Euro-Americas and beyond. He targeted his own Christianity as a source, but his focus on religion doesn't answer the deeper question of why early Christians promoted human supremacy and why this dominion orientation remains so persistent thousands of years later. White would not be surprised by these questions. In his 1973 follow-up essay, he noted how, quote, the search for causes is like peeling the proverbial onion. There is always a deeper cause, end quote. Our aim is to extend White's thesis by inquiring into the affective drivers of human supremacy, particularly the political force of death denial. In the face of finitude, human feelings of fear and belittlement can fuel Euro-Americans' attachment to narratives of supremacy. Or, as Inuk throat singer Tanya Tagaq sings in her song Retribution, we invest our time in hollow philosophies to placate the fear of our bodies returning back into our mother. In making this connection between death denial and narratives of human supremacy, we draw from three main sources. First, we engage the work of anthropologist Ernest Becker, the Euro-American thinker who has done the most to clarify the linkages between the two. While a small number of scholars have drawn on Becker's work to explain ecological destruction, little has been done to link his insights on death denial to environmental destruction in general and long-standing Euro-American attachments to human supremacy in particular. Second, we turn to Indigenous Studies scholars Vine Deloria Jr. and Michael Yellowbird, whose work discusses the open and accepting orientation toward mortality among many Indigenous nations and the role this different orientation plays in facilitating non-supremacist relations with the more than human world. While environmental studies scholarship has long looked to Indigenous worldviews and land-caring practices for models of reciprocal relations with the more than human world, scholars have yet to explore the connection between non-supremacist worldviews and different orientations to mortality. Third, we develop a case study of Coast Salish approaches to mortality, arguing that the non-supremacist worldviews and ecological successes of Salish peoples, upon whose territories we both live, are deeply connected to their different orientation toward death, especially when compared to Euro-American death denial. Our case study shows that environmental education and advocacy must begin by addressing the death fear that underpins Euro-American culture. We undertake this analysis from an anti-colonial perspective because we are committed to not only learning from Indigenous knowledge systems, but also supporting Indigenous sovereignty. We are using collective pronouns because this chapter was co-authored. James's biography is shared in chapter 1. Darcy Matthews is of mixed Cree European ancestry. His father is Cree from Muskakis and was separated from his mother, Cecilia Goodeye, during the 60s scoop. His mother was of mixed German and Mennonite and English ancestry. Darcy did not grow up in Muskakis and only in the past 4 years has been reunited with his father's family. 7 years ago, he was adopted into the family of Selma Joan Morris, an elder of the Songhees Nation, whom we acknowledge for her guidance. Darcy has spent 20 years working with Coast Salish funerary experts to manage ancestral human burial sites. We acknowledge the expertise and guidance of these experts as we seek, as differently positioned settlers on Coast Salish lands, to understand the relationship between approaches to mortality, historical connections to the land, and the primacy of a place-based concentric ecology, a concept developed by Enrique Salmo that we explore more fully in our case study. So he's laying out the chapter ahead there. I just want to briefly say for folks that don't know, as he shared the biography of Darcy Matthews, I'm sure many of us know about the residential schools that in both Canada and the US, Indigenous children were sent to. And even when that more or less came to an end, there was something that was called the 60s scoop. And that was when governments were basically still taking Indigenous children away from their parents and adopting them out into white families. I don't know how common that was in the US, but it was a big thing in Canada. Indigenous parents were considered to be unfit. And so these children were removed from their biological families and brought into white families. And often those adoptive parents were told that these children were orphaned, when in fact they had just been physically removed from their parents, from their families. I'm gonna pause there. Questions, comments, thoughts, and then maybe also ask somebody else to pick up the reading the next section. Any queries or? Kat has added those undertakings because of eugenics thinking. I tend not to, I mean, maybe somebody else would use the word eugenics. I mean, just racism, frankly, that Indigenous peoples were still seen as inferior to the dominant culture, that that more primitive, less able to parent. Karen says popular culture film, Little Bird. Yes. So it really was the racist thinking. And we still have, like, a lot of people would argue that the foster system in Canada and the US is still, it's the the reimagining of residential schools, because in Canada, it's Indigenous children who are overrepresented in the foster care system in the same way that Indigenous people are overrepresented in the prison system. And of course, if we were to take a step back and think about what these communities have experienced in terms of genocide, in terms of the destruction of families and traditional ways, they're struggling with a lot more than the white Western mainstream counterpart. So sometimes there are issues around perhaps addictions, or particular not knowing how to parent, or I shouldn't say not knowing, lacking some of the skills that would be of service. But that's kind of the fault of the dominant culture, that we've created that fracture. And so instead of trying to address the harm is perpetuated again and again with each generation. So that may have been a bigger answer than you wanted, Kat, but oh, okay, I thought I missed a comment. But yeah, and there's a big movement right now for 60 Scoop survivors, as they're known, to be finding their parents and rediscovering their culture. And I know a handful of folks here in Ottawa that are part of that. Valerie.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I'm adopted, yeah, in the 60s, not Indigenous, but in the 60s. And I'm just so touched by that paragraph, where at the end of the paragraph where he was adopted into this family. And I think for me, the idea of being adopted into a real chosen family like that, after having things decided for me when I was young, like that is so tender and beautiful. I like, yeah, that it's something that I've like thought in my head a few times. Like that would be like, I'd love to be adopted into a family like now as an adult, like to have like family that way. And just to see someone get like, I thought that was a ridiculous idea to have. And to see someone in this particularly special situation have that happen, it just really is touching to me. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that, Valerie. And two things come to mind as you say that. I mean, well, no, three things at least, because I wish that for you too. But this is happening a lot. So Darcy's experienced this, but this is happening a lot. And so there is, I mean, there's still so much suffering, but a lot of people as adults are being reclaimed by their communities and by those families. But the other thing that comes to mind for me is that, like, this too is an example how if we were to look through the eyes of another culture, and it gives us like this, like, oh, how could I be adopted as an adult? And then you see that, like, oh, this is how, another people understand family, understand, all my relations. That has been a huge influence on me in the last, 20 years or so, all my relations. And that means the stone, the grass, my cousin, my long dead grandparents, all my relations. And what is it to move through our days keeping sight of that, of all those connections? And I guess that's it. Like, we're the dominant culture, and I'm like, man, we're impoverished by comparison. So that I too feel that sort of, maybe hope isn't like that wish for something else, but also an understanding that, oh, I actually can have that a little bit, because that's, if I just change my own manner, my own way of thinking, then it opens up. And Kat has said, I feel eugenics the ideology that aimed to improve the genetic quality of human populations, often through coercive or unethical means, impacted cultural beliefs more than was credited in a negative way. Yeah, that's probably very true. And, you know, the 60s scoop may not have been a specifically eugenics policy, but certainly, you know, in that same time and even until all too recently, forced sterilization of Indigenous women was still happening. So the thing you speak of, Kat, definitely a thing that was happening on both sides of the border. And I mean, I wouldn't say it doesn't even happen now, but it's certainly in our lifetime it was still happening. Australia too. Okay, thanks, Kat. Yeah, yeah. Does somebody want to pick up the reading? Oh, I can keep going. Or Karen, are you going to jump in? Thank you.
Ernest Becker died at the age of 49, months before his book, The Denial of Death, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. According to Becker and the terror management researchers his work inspired, the intense existential fear caused by the reality of death compels humans to psychologically buffer themselves with cultural constructions of supremacy that compensate for the overwhelming helplessness they feel in the face of finitude. The human animal, like other animals, possesses a will to live. What distinguishes us from our fellow critters, according to Becker, is an evolutionary inheritance, the cognitive ability to imagine and anticipate our own end. For Becker, a will to life combined with, excuse me just a minute, the cognitive capacity to imagine death has led humans to a level of existential anxiety seemingly unique in the animal kingdom. There was something in here I wanted to, okay, the human animal, like other animals, possesses a will to live. How do we know that?
I think the fact that an animal will fight to live tells you know,
okay.
I mean, that's how I
They
see
won't.
it.
Yeah, and an animal will chew off its paw to break free from a trap so it can survive and live.
Yeah. Yeah, or flee from a a forest fire. Like there is an
Right.
instinct towards life, I guess.
Even
Yeah,
the
I think the word
butterfly.
will, the word will is what got me here. So, but I mean, I certainly understand that there's an energy force to keep. I just didn't know how to interpret the word will. Okay. Death denial for Becker plays a formative role in all cultures. The primary mechanism for denying death is cultural and involves creating the conditions for symbolic immortality, for heroism. Society is, for Becker, a symbolic action system, a structure of statuses and roles, customs and rules for behavior, designed to serve as a vehicle for earthly heroism. Each culture has a unique hero system that provides multiple pathways to heroism. People pursue heroics to earn a feeling of cosmic specialness, a sense that their life is significant beyond the dust they will one day become. For Becker, the real world is simply too terrible to admit. It tells humans that they are small, trembling animals who will decay and die. Illusion changes all this, makes humans seem important, vital to the universe, immortal in some way. Narratives of human supremacy are one such illusion. They allow believers to feel heroic, to feel cosmically special. We are the chosen species, as Becker states, quote, the frail human creature tries to change his position from one of insignificance in the face of nature to one of central importance from one of inability to cope with the overwhelming world to one of absolute control and mastery of nature, end quote. In the 50 years since Becker's death, TMT scholars have tested his theory multiple times. The experiments that relate most to our topic at hand entail priming a test group on their mortality, either with explicit or subliminal reminders of death, and then tracking how participants respond to different situations or written statements. When reminded of their mortality, test subjects tend to do two things. One, they increase their commitment to worldviews, and two, they pursue self-esteem according to the standards of their preferred worldview. Although the canonical TMT experiment did fail, a replication effort in 2019, to date, over 500 experiments in 25 countries have supported Becker's account of how fear of death shapes human behavior. Numerous tests have linked fear of death to the idea of human supremacy. For example, a 2007 study found that test subjects primed on their mortality were more likely to report negative views of animals. A follow-up study examined whether the findings were similar for pet owners, who presumably have more positive attitudes towards animals than the generational population. The researchers found that even pet owners evaluate animals and activities that elevate the status of those animals less favorably when they are reminded of their own creaturely and mortal nature. Likewise, another study found that death reminders increased participant support for the killing of animals. According to the researchers, the idea that humans are different from and superior to other animals is a fundamental part of most worldviews, and this is certainly true of the mainstream American view. I just remember that I was in a smoky place today and my throat is kind of weird and I'm going to start coughing if I read much more. So if somebody else would take it, I would appreciate it.
I'll take it. Okay. In an interesting twist, a study published in 2018 revealed that challenging the illusion of human supremacy brings forth the thoughts of death that the illusion serves to repress. Researchers had the test group read an article arguing that dolphins are more intelligent than humans, and found that the article brought forth high levels of death-related thoughts in the test group when compared with participants who read an article about dolphin intelligence that did not connect dolphins to humans. Terror management researchers measure death thought accessibility, DTA, by asking participants to complete fill-in-the-blank tests such as cough, dash. Participants with greater DTA are more likely to write coffin. Oh, I thought it was coffee. While control subjects are more likely to write coffee. Maybe you had a different idea. The findings from these studies support the link between fear of death and a belief in human supremacy in the Euro-American worldview. According to Becker's theoretical framework, all doctrines of supremacy, whether of race, nation, class, gender, or species, are efforts to achieve cosmic specialness for the elect, efforts to fend off the pain of existential insignificance. All power, writes Becker, is in essence power to deny mortality. He continues, either that or it is not real power at all, not ultimate power, not the power that humankind is really obsessed with. Power means power to increase oneself, to change one's natural situation from one of smallness, helplessness, finitude to one of bigness, control, durability, importance. Becker was interested not only in articulating the Euro-American worldview, but also in exploring what Euro-Americans could learn from different approaches, particularly indigenous worldviews. Becker theorized that all worldviews, no matter how diverse, are hero systems designed to protect against existential anxiety. He noted, however, that some worldviews are less destructive than others. He commended indigenous societies for giving their members, quote, less invidious and competitive forms of self-expansion, unquote. He particularly referenced the potlatch ceremonies of Pacific Northwest indigenous peoples, where leaders would redistribute large amounts of wealth and gain prestige from acts of generosity. Euro-Americans, he argued, should look to them for inspiration and seek to craft, quote, non-destructive yet victorious, unquote, social systems that satisfy the need for heroism without precipitating the wreckage that comes from doctrines of supremacy. Do we want to pause here for a moment?
I have a question for others. You know, like Karen, I'm in death care. I'm happy to blame everything on the fear of mortality. You know, like that suits me fine. But I'm curious if for others, if you're like, maybe that's giving it a bit too much weight, or if that lands for you that like, oh gosh, that really feels like that's sort of what's at the foundation of all forms of supremacy, or maybe it's something that you just, you know, it's a fresh idea. I mean, I know when I'm in conversation with folks, almost anything that's happening, I can take it back to grief illiteracy or the denial of death, and I'm also always trying to keep myself in check, that like maybe allow other things to be happening too.
I wonder that a lot when I hear about it, like sort of sounding like the only possible thing. But then I was also thinking about how things get passed down to us that we don't realize in our, with our culture, passing them down, and how they even talk about, monkeys and rats learning things like not to press buttons because this other monkey had a bad thing like happen 6 generations ago. And so the new monkeys know not to press the button. And I was just thinking, like, if this is so ingrained in me from all the different passing downs amongst this family that I've had, yeah, like it might be so far back, like I don't even realize how deep it is in me. And that could be some of that unconscious bias toward it that that was being mentioned. So, but I also can see it too. So it's kind of both, I guess.
Yeah, I was thinking
This just brought up this crazy idea about so many people now, it seems, want to participate. When they think about their death, the first thing that comes to mind is medical aid in dying. I mean, I'm seeing this across the spectrum. I want to be able to do it. So is it really, I think, it's like, okay, this is starting to make my brain hurt. You want to avoid death by controlling your death, because you believe that the death that you create, talk about supremacy, human supremacy, the death that you create won't be a bad death.
But it's, I mean, yes, I'm encountering the same thing, Karen, and and I'm probably similarly troubled. And I mean, this is maybe more of a sidebar. I teach a death doula course, and we're in our inaugural edition of it. And I had an email from somebody this week that like I'm still in the wake of it and still like appreciating it. And this person's parents died when he was a child, so he has a very big grief story. But relative to what you're talking about, Karen, he emailed me this week, and among other things, he said, I have always hoped and wished I would have a quick and painless death. And a month into this course, I'm already realizing I want something else.
Mm,
And
wow.
I'm still so, like, I didn't think about that as a potential outcome. But again, just to be in the contemplation of this work and what does it mean? And for people to start realizing that, like, my God, we left something on the table, that there are gifts that we're leaving behind. So I know we're moving a little bit away from what the book is about, but I do find that to be very compelling, to say the least. And it is, what you were saying, Valerie, like, I think this stuff can persist over generations for sure. But what I worry about is, it's sort of like when everything, like, no matter what goes wrong, well, it's the patriarchy. And I feel like, well, that's not very nuanced. And I worry a little bit that I do the same thing around, I blame everything on fear of death. But I do think you can make a pretty good case for a lot of the troubles might rest on this. Oh, and Kat had a comment. I came to the thought that the fear of death keeps us separate from our spiritual truth on my own. Then I went looking for books on the topic. That is how I found my way to the radical mindfulness in this group. But that's great. Thanks, Kat. That's good to know. And I also find it interesting that so many spiritual traditions have a contemplation of death as part of their own teaching and practice. And that tells me that there is surely some kind of wisdom, longstanding wisdom around the fact that this helps us to be better humans.
I was thinking, along with the fear of death, is a nuanced fear of insecurity. For example, ancestral of not being able to fulfill your duty, your role as a provider, or as bringing food to the family shelter and all that, and having this sense of needing recognition, of needing to feel that you are somebody that has contributed. And along with that, if you're needing recognition from outside yourself, you're not in tune with your true essence. And if you are, then there's no reason to feel insecure, because you are totally connected with all life, all nature, and our oneness in that stream of consciousness and existence. So there's fear of death, but I think there's so many other fears that are woven into that fear. And you look at ancestral lines and how people had to fear that, they had a fear that if they didn't conquer nature, they were not going to survive. They would have the fear of not providing for their family, and there's death too. But the fact that they would have let down the loved ones by not giving them or providing for them what they needed. So yeah, just thoughts that were coming through, but lots of nuanced fear in there, along with fear of death.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times these things need to be contextualized. to be understood. You know, it's this idea of complexity rather than singularity, and the complexity maybe applies to this as well. Despite this insight, Becker failed to explain why some societies, for example, settler cultures on Turtle Island, embrace doctrines of supremacy, when others, for example, the Haudenosaunee, can meet their existential needs in less destructive ways. Having answers to this question would support contemporary efforts to promote more egalitarian worldviews. One answer is that perhaps death fear is more malleable and less universal than he allowed for, as we were saying. Maybe some cultures have learned to overcome their existential anxiety to the point where the need for compensatory heroism is not so great, thereby quelling the will for supremacy. Indigenous approaches to death. In the same year that Becker published The Denial of Death, Vine Deloria Jr., a key figure in the disciplinary formation of Indigenous studies, released God is Red, a Native View of Religion, which challenged one of Becker's key premises. Recall that death-denying illusions, for Becker, are integral to all cultures, and that some illusions are more destructive than others. Although he was not referring to Becker's theories specifically, Deloria Jr. challenged Becker's universalism when he observed that rather than fearing death, tribal religions see it as an affirmation of life's reality. He continued, quote, "The Indian ability to deal with death was a result of the much larger context in which Indians understood life. Human beings were an integral part of the natural world, and in death, they contributed their bodies to become the dust that nourished the plants and animals that had fed people during their lifetime." I'm going to pause there just to make note. I think I said this in a previous week, but I feel like it's important that, you know, we have the dominion over nature, the human supremacy that we often encounter, but sometimes the opposite end of the spectrum is that humans are parasites and the world would be better without us. And I think that that's just as problematic, and frankly also not true. And so I really appreciate this point that human beings were an integral part of the natural world, and in death they contributed their bodies to become the dust that nourished the plants and animals that had fed people during their lifetime. So, you know, this idea that we are part of that web, and we're not above it, but we're not unworthy of it.
Yeah, the worms got to eat too.
Worms got to eat too. Yeah. For Deloria Jr., Indigenous approaches to mortality are linked to non-supremacist worldviews that position humans as fundamentally integrated with the natural world. Upon their physical death, humans feed other life forms, much as animals nourish humans when they are hunted and eaten. How did some Indigenous nations achieve relative equanimity in the face of death? It's difficult to disagree with Becker's claim that death is fundamentally troubling for the human animal. But clearly, fear of death is more malleable than he allowed for. For example, Arikara scholar Michael Yellowbird has written about the rituals his community once used to rehearse for death. In one ritual, for instance, a tribal member was chosen to represent death, to dress up and don body paint. The chosen one then left the village and prepared in isolation to return as death. According to Yellowbird, the arrival triggered deep emotional responses. As the ritual closed, death left the village, disappearing into the hills. Elders then talked with fellow community members to hear how the encounter had impacted them. a comment from Karen in the chat. So in our time, the reimagined value of natural burial may actually help to accelerate this notion that our death can feed life too. Absolutely. It's a beautiful, and Valerie says, it brings to mind a word you used earlier, obligation. Yeah, not just our nature today, but our obligation as part of the larger family system. Kat asks, does natural burial mean no formaldehyde? It does, among other things. Basically, everything needs to be biodegradable that goes into the earth. And there's a few other things, like we bury it around the the 3 to 4 foot mark because there's more anaerobic. There's more of the processes that break down the body are happening there versus at the 6 foot mark. So
Also, no vaults, or
yeah.
everything has to be biodegradable.
And depending on how strict they are, there's no marker or anything that, some of those details I think change from place to place, but basically natural burial is with the understanding that all of this is being returned to the earth. And so we choose with that in mind, that is this food? Will it generously nourish the ones to come? I've lost my spot. Oh, sorry. I did lose my spot. I'm trying again here. Sergei Khan's work with the Tinglet has likewise demonstrated how their mortuary potlatches transform death into a largely life-affirming event. That's interesting. I've never thought about potlatches that way. Depending on the culture, potlatches are days-long gift-giving feasts, rituals, and ceremonies held to commemorate the death of a chief or the head of a house, to facilitate the passing of names, titles, and responsibilities to inheritors, to distribute tangible and intangible wealth, and to serve other vital functions necessary for the continuance of the community's culture and economy. Throughout this section, we oscillate between past and present tense when discussing different Indigenous rituals. A number of these practices are ongoing or being revitalized despite colonial disruption, though some, like the rehearsals for death described by Yellowbird, exist for now in the past. For Yellowbird, Indigenous rituals share commonalities with Buddhist-inspired mindfulness practices, which are increasingly the subject of scientific study. Indigenous peoples, he writes, have been engaged in practices that incorporated mind-body meditation and mindfulness principles for thousands of years. According to a TMT study, assuming that's terror management theory. According to a terror management theory study published in 2019, mindfulness practices can reduce defensive responses to death fears, reaffirming that one can overcome existential anxiety and reduce compensatory illusions of supremacy. The study involved Buddhist and non-Buddhist participants in South Korea and the United States. The authors, Young Jin Park and Tom Shizinski, found that non-Buddhists in both countries who were put through a 20-minute meditation protocol did not become more defensive of their worldviews after being primed on their mortality, but the control subjects did, as is predicted by TMT, terror management theory. They also found that experienced Buddhist practitioners did not react defensively when reminded of their own mortality, even when they did not meditate before the experiment, a finding that suggests the enduring effect of mindfulness practice. I'm just turning to the comments. Karen suggests that, checking out the Green Burial Council and the Natural Home Funeral Alliance. Yeah, great information there. And Karen also says Roshi, Joan Halifax's book, Being with Dying, is a wonderful source. I agree. And she's at the Upaya Zen Center. The authors go even further in pinpointing the mechanism that reduces defensiveness. Previous studies have shown that when test subjects are primed on their mortality, they predictably suppress the reality of death, pushing it out of their conscious minds. The prospect of death gets buried in our psyches, where we work to unconsciously tame it by clinging to fantasies of supremacy that soothe our fears of annihilation. But Park and Jasinski found that meditation halted through thought suppression, allowing death fears to be experienced consciously. This consciousness, like in the death rehearsal ritual described by Yellowbird, facilitates a non-defensiveness response to mortality priming. Park and Jasinski conclude that, quote, responding defensively to thoughts of death by initially suppressing such thoughts and then defending one's worldview when they rebound is not an inevitable response to this existential problem, end quote. Writing 50 years earlier, Deloria Jr. made a similar point when he noted, quote, Indians know that people die. They accept death as a fact of life. Rather than build a series of logical syllogisms that reason away grief, Indian people have a ceremony of mourning by which grief can be properly expressed. When death is suppressed, as it is in the Christian religion, death becomes an entity in itself and is something to be feared, end quote. In effect, ritual and ceremony are mindfulness practices that help reduce existential defensiveness by consciously metabolizing death and by consciously metabolizing death fear. While more research, yeah, go ahead.
I was just thinking about the Buddhist part of this as a Buddhist person. And I'm not quite sure if I was looking at the top paragraph where they were talking about the Buddhists didn't react defensively when reminded that our own mortality, suggesting the enduring effect of mindfulness practice. And I guess I'm not sure if they're saying there, but if that's like just the act of meditating is mindfulness practice, which would make you less aggravated by the thought of death coming up. But I mean, a lot of Buddhists also practice the remembrances, you know, often daily, or, you know, I do it multiple times a week, not always daily, but, you know, reminding myself of my nature to like age, get sick, die, become separated from things I care about. That's just always the worst one for me. But you know, and I wonder if that's just sort of rolled in and included there. Because I don't think just necessarily meditating without doing that might have the same effects. And so I just wanted to name that for reasons I'm not quite sure. But I do think, I guess what I'm thinking is the intentionality of that part of the Buddhist practice that maybe like mainstream, just like mindfulness movements wouldn't have in them, for example, I think is important.
I think that's a really great question because, you know, on one hand, I don't think you have to do the 5 remembrances particularly. I think there's other things you could do that are going to address that fear of death. But you're right. If you were doing a mindful practice that was maybe just a body scan, would that still have the same impact? Does it have an impact, but like maybe a dissolution meditation would have more of an impact? Like that, that's not being noted here. So I think that's a really great follow-up question. I would say though that I know, like my master's research, one thing that I know from looking at this is that this point that, you know, experienced practitioners didn't need to do the meditation to have that benefit, that they've,
Right.
you know, and it's the idea of it goes from a state to a trait,
Mm-hmm.
that if you
Mhm.
practice enough, it becomes an embodied trait, and you're not just like dropping into it for 10 minutes each morning. And so I think that point would probably apply broadly. Anxiety, depression, fear of death, like all of those things, you're just that groundedness persists.
Yeah, I like the language of state to a trait. Thank you for sharing that.
I'll take us just to the end of this section. I know it's 8 o'clock, but maybe if you allow me another moment. While more research on mind-body practices and death denial is needed, Park and Shazinski's study suggests that existential defensiveness can determine whether a worldview is human supremacist or more egalitarian. Following Deloria Jr. and Yellowbird, we suspect that some indigenous nations use story and mindfulness techniques such as ceremony and ritual to transform fear and denial of death into an affirmation of earthly life. This reduction of existential fear, in turn, supports non-supremacist worldviews and produces better ecological outcomes. Quote, from our traditional trickster stories that long preceded European and American colonialism, writes Michael Yellowbird, many of us realize that we humans can be a fairly egotistical and negative species, end quote. He continues, the importance of understanding the risks of negativity and an overinflated ego are undoubtedly one of the many reasons that our ancestors urged us to practice deep introspection and humility in our daily lives, end quote. In other words, cultures that recognize the fear and defensiveness that we humans can easily feel in the face of finitude, and that in turn have developed resources for facing and transforming that fear, are more likely to produce non-supremacist and egalitarian worldviews. There's a lot to unpack in that paragraph. I think that's very interesting. And I'm thinking too, I have a few friends who are indigenous and talk about, largely in Anishinaabe, the place that the people that are the traditional folks of this place. But the idea of trickster and, the sacred clown, and that they could, like, as a force, as a being, the harm, how punitive it could be. And so, like as an example, that if your community wasn't properly grateful for the harvest, the food you're receiving, then trickster would come in and destroy the stores of food, or would, give you drought for the next 2-3 years. That there was this idea that, so never mind, like if you started even to be a little bit tipping into human domination or supremacy, that trickster, that again, the sacred clown would come in and bring death as a way to remind you of what your place is in the, in the whole and the all. And so just to sort of populate our thinking a little bit with that, like we just don't have an equivalent. Bad things happen, but we don't see it as a teacher, or like I think when something bad happens, we also, as white Westerners, tend to want more of what we were doing. Like a big hurricane comes in and destroys a community, we don't think of it as like, maybe we shouldn't have built in those places, and maybe we weren't honoring the rivers and the oceans. No, instead we need more technology to protect, our capital, our infrastructure. Anyway, not to go off on too much of a tangent, but that for me is another place where it's like, oh, that's a really different worldview. And I've heard different stories about, the way a community is reminded of not not considering themselves to be above all of these other processes that are underway, and if you do start to get that way, that another force will come in and remind you of, you know, our human frailty. Anyway, just some thoughts to leave you with. I'll go ahead and stop the recording. Thanks everyone for another really delicious read, and we will begin next week near the top of page 105, Post-Salish Ways of Death and Life, and we are in chapter 5. So thank you all.
Thanks, Kelly. Good night, all.